This is Let's Read Health Inequalities and Social Determinants of Aboriginal People's Health by Charlotte Reading and Fred Wien. Okay, we're going to move down past the table of contents, past the list of tables, to the introduction. This paper uses available data to describe health inequalities experienced by diverse Aboriginal peoples in Canada. The data are organized around social determinants of health across the life course and provide evidence that not only demonstrates important health disparities within Aboriginal groups and compared to non-Aboriginal people, but also links social determinants at proximal, intermediate, and distal levels to health inequities. The integrated life course and social determinants model of Aboriginal health is introduced as a promising conceptual framework for understanding the relationship between social determinants and various health dimensions, as well as examining potential trajectories of health across the life course. Data from diverse and often limited literature is provided to support claims made by the authors of this paper and others about health disparities among Aboriginal peoples and the degree to which inequalities in the social determinants of health act as barriers to addressing health disparities. Additional tables have been included in the appendices to further support data and discussion presented in this text. And you can see the note at the bottom that they're using the term Aboriginal to refer to individuals who identify with at least one Aboriginal group. So that would be First Nations, North American Indian, Métis, or Inuit. Okay, Chapter 2, Social Determinants of Aboriginal Health. Beyond a small number of seminal reports, little is known about the distinct influences of social determinants of health in the lives of Aboriginal people. Yet it is clear that the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual dimensions of health among Aboriginal children, youth, and adults are distinctly, as well as differently influenced by a broad range of social determinants. These circumstances and environments, as well as structures, systems, and institutions that influence the development and maintenance of health along a continuum from excellent to poor. For the purposes of this report, the social determinants of health have been categorized as distal, so for example, historical, political, social, and economic contexts, as intermediate, so for example, community infrastructure, resource systems, and capacities, and proximal, for example, health behaviors, physical and social environment. Social determinants influence a wide range of health vulnerabilities and capacities, health behaviors, and health management. Individuals, communities, and nations that experience health inequalities in the social determinants of health not only carry an additional burden of health problems, but they're often restricted from access to resources that might ameliorate the problem. Not only do social determinants influence diverse dimensions of health, but they also create health issues that often lead to circumstances and environments that, in turn, represent subsequent determinants of health. So, for instance, living in conditions of low income have been linked to increased illness and disability, which in turn represents a social determinant, which is linked to diminished opportunities to engage in gainful employment, thereby aggravating poverty. Researchers and those responsible for the development of health policies have reached tentative consensus about an extensive list of social determinants that influence the health of individuals, communities, and populations. What remain less well articulated are the mechanisms and contexts through which social determinants influence health. Similarly, aside from the healthcare system, we know relatively little about the social determinants of health at play in addressing ill health. Researchers are just beginning to map out the complex interconnections that exist and are demonstrating those linkages empirically. So section 2.1, sociopolitical context. The impact of social determinants is manifest differently among the distinct Aboriginal groups in Canada, which are themselves distinct from other Indigenous groups globally. Among Aboriginal peoples, there are a number of similar historical contemporary social determinants that have shaped the health and well-being of individuals, families, communities, and nations. Historically, the ancestors of all three Aboriginal groups underwent colonization and the imposition of colonial institutions, systems, as well as lifestyle disruption. However, distinctions in the origin, form, and impact of those social determinants, as well as the distinct peoples involved, must also be considered if health interventions are to be successful. For example, while the mechanisms and impact of colonization, as well as historic and neocolonialism, are similar among all Aboriginal groups, particular policies such as the Indian Act have been patently deleterious to the lives and the health of First Nations people. First Nations are unique in their relationship with the Canadian government with respect to the provisions made under the Indian Act of 1876, which include health care. The contemporary outcome of the colonial process can be seen in political, social, and economic domains. For First Nations, Inuit, and to a lesser extent Métis peoples, the colonial process has resulted in diminished self-determination and a lack of influence in policies that directly relate to Aboriginal individuals and communities. All Aboriginal groups have suffered losses of language, land, and sociocultural resources. Racism, discrimination, and social exclusion also represent shared experiences among Aboriginal groups, with Métis people often experiencing exclusion from First Nations and Inuit as well. Aboriginal peoples differently experience economic disadvantage. Métis tend to experience higher levels of socioeconomic status than First Nations, who fare generally better than Inuit people. In general, remote communities, whether they're Métis, Inuit, or First Nations, suffer from a lack of economic development that might help to ameliorate health problems related to socioeconomic status. Section 2.2, a holistic perspective of health. Indigenous ideologies embrace a holistic concept of health that reflects physical, spiritual, emotional, and mental dimensions. However, it is the interrelatedness of these dimensions that is perhaps most noteworthy. It has become widely accepted in mainstream health literature and to some extent practice that a, quote, silo, unquote, approach to the prevention and treatment of ill health fails to address the complexity of most health issues. So the silo approach is like if you can imagine a grain field, and you have individual silos that are standing there instead of something that's holistic, which would be everything kind of combined and influencing each other, just to give a definition of that word. This is particularly true for Aboriginal peoples who have historically been collectivist in their social institutions and processes, specifically the ways in which health is perceived and addressed. Section 2.3, Life Course, Child, Youth, and Adult. Health is not only experienced across physical, spiritual, emotional, and mental dimensions, but is also experienced over the life course. A lifelong trajectory of health begins during gestation, with the health profile and social determinants affecting the health resources for pregnant women. Early child development follows, in which the circumstances of the physical and emotional environment impact not only children's current health, but sets the groundwork for future vulnerabilities and resiliencies. In as much as social determinants impact children, youth, and adults in similar ways, they tend to manifest as different health issues in each life stage. Initially, the early years can be conceptualized as two overlapping phases of early and late childhood. The outcomes of early and late child development is first evident in adolescence, when social determinants continue to impact the distinct elements of adolescent well-being. Like childhood, adulthood can be viewed as two integrated phases which distinguish elderhood as a life phase that has specific vulnerabilities and health potentials. Social determinants not only have differential impact on health across the life course, but the ensuing health issues may themselves create conditions, i.e. determinants, that subsequently influence health. For instance, poverty is associated with increased substance use, which can lead to stressful family environments and diminished social support, which are linked to, among other things, depression. Physical environments such as crowded housing conditions have been associated with stress in all three groups. However, for adults, these conditions can also directly contribute to substance overuse and parenting difficulties, which may result in poor school performance among children and youth. This particular interaction of life stage health begins with a social determinant, which contributes to the creation of an environment for youth and child development. If a less than optimal environment is present, children and youth will not only face obstacles to optimal physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual development, but the difficulties they encounter will also likely create additional stressors for families and communities. In this case, youth substance overuse and violence, as well as behavior problems in children, have been linked to overcrowded living conditions. Section 2.4, a note on the adequacy of Aboriginal public health data. Compared to the situation a few decades ago, there's been a significant increase in the quantity and quality of Aboriginal health data. The Aboriginal Peoples Survey, or APS, for example, which was introduced by Statistics Canada in 1991, marked a significant step forward, even though the number of health-related questions is limited in this general-purpose survey. Additionally, the First Nations Relational Longitudinal Health Survey, or FNRLHS, has provided a wealth of new information on the on-reserve population beginning in 1997. As far as the health survey information is concerned, we will turn to other types of data below. There are still important gaps and challenges which limit what we can do in this paper. Available data. This is now a list. Available data are fragmented in the sense that individual surveys do not comprehensively include all Aboriginal groups. Over time, the APS, for example, has become less inclusive. It's still quite valuable for the off-reserve population, but for the most part is not carried out on reserve. The FNRLHS is quite good for the on-reserve population, but does not include First Nations off-reserve, Inuit, or Métis populations. Often the pieces do not add together in that different authorities are responsible for different surveys and methodologies differ. Even if a concept is measured in more than one survey, questions may not be worded in the same way, and thus the results are not comparable. Important gaps in the survey information base remain. Statistics Canada routinely completes surveys on a whole host of issues, dealing with subjects like activity limitations, time use, adaptation to new technologies, the aging population, and transition to retirement, public safety, and the victims of crime. However, First Nations persons living on reserve are almost always excluded from the surveys, and coverage of Aboriginal people living off reserve, including Métis and Inuit, may be too sparse for detailed analysis, especially at geographic units below the nation or provincial territorial level. So like they mean municipalities, for example. Other kinds of public health data are also problematic. Smiley and Anderson have worked with vital registration, health surveillance, health services, surveillance, and infant health child data. They identify the following issues among others. So first is the lack of accurate and complete identification of Aboriginal persons, and indeed the fact that Aboriginal affiliation is often not asked at all. The fragmentation of data resulting from the fact that health systems differ according to Aboriginal ethnicity, geography, for example, on and off reserve, and jurisdiction, for example, provincial and federal. The use of substandard data sources and methodologies. For example, infant mortality rates for First Nations persons living on reserve are based on vital registration data of uneven quality from 4 Western provinces combined with data collected from nursing stations in other parts of the country. The resulting figures are deemed to be an underestimate, a statement that is based on comparison to other data available for certain regions, but collected according to a higher standard. The failure to include culturally relevant health measures reflecting Indigenous perspectives. These data limitations impose at least 2 limitations for this paper. First, they mean that we seldom are able to report comparable data for all the different Aboriginal groups on the same dimension. While this is possible using the census, which also permits comparisons with the rest of the Canadian population, it's usually not possible with other data sources. Secondly, it means that we must avoid reporting some kinds of data, such as infant mortality rates or adult death rates, that would normally be included in this kind of report as outcome measures, but which, in the case of Aboriginal people, may be unreliable or lack external validity. In short, while considerable progress on Aboriginal public health data has been made, what we have remains far short of the standard of data available for other Canadians. On the assumption that a high-quality health information base is an important cornerstone for health research and for evidence-based public policy, this is an issue that should be of concern to the Public Health Agency of Canada. Chapter 3, Proximal Determinants of Health. According to the United Nations Human Development Index, which measures health through longevity, educational achievement, and adult literacy, First Nations people in Canada rank 68th in the world. Likewise, the Community Wellbeing Scale for First Nations, developed by Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, which measures education, labor force participation, income, and housing, indicates that Aboriginal communities represent 65 of the 100 unhealthiest Canadian communities. According to the model presented in this report, proximal determinants of health include conditions that have a direct impact on physical, emotional, mental, or spiritual health. For example, in conditions of overcrowding, which are the most profoundly experienced among the Inuit people, Children often have little room to study or play, while adults have no private space to relax. In many cases, these conditions act as a stressor, which increases the likelihood of behavioral and learning difficulties in children and adolescents, as well as substance abuse and other problems among adults. Similarly, family violence, which is experienced at one time or another by almost 3/4 of on-reserve First Nations women, directly impacts all family dimensions of health, especially women's health, with a resulting negative impact on the physical and emotional health of children. The mechanisms through which proximal determinants influence health are not well articulated in the literature. However, some researchers have made tentative suggestions which seem to be supported by the epidemiology of Aboriginal health. By creating minimal capacity to meet basic survival needs, i.e. poverty, unfavorable proximal determinants can contribute to stressors that in turn can generate or exacerbate health problems. Moreover, individuals acquire personal skills and resources for coping with health challenges and developing health behaviors throughout life. These skills and resources help people deal with challenges as well as cope with illness and injury. When proximal determinants of health do not support control over the basic material resources of life, choice, which is key to health, is denied. Some research suggests that health outcomes are influenced by the type of communities or neighborhoods in which one lives. Indian and Northern Affairs Canada has created a Community Wellbeing Index, which results in the composite score for a community based on the characteristics of its residents, specifically their income, education, housing quantity and quality, and labor force characteristics like participation and employment rates. Table 1, which is on the top of this page, reveals that the Community Wellbeing Score for First Nations and Inuit communities is well below that of Canadian communities. However, analysis of the CWB score over time shows that the score improves for all three types of communities. It also shows a small degree of convergence over the course of the 1991 to 2001 period. Section 3.1, Health Behaviors. Health behaviors represent a well-recognized proximal determinant of health. Among Aboriginal peoples, the most relevant health behaviors include the over or misuse of alcohol, which is related to increases in all case mortalities, and excessive smoking, the health effects of which are clearly expressed in high rates of heart disease and increasing rates of lung cancer. Poor prenatal care, as well as drinking and smoking during pregnancy, have also been linked to poor physical, emotional, and intellectual development among Aboriginal children. Finally, lack of exercise and poor diet has been associated with the epidemic of type 2 diabetes among First Nations adults and increasing rates among First Nations youth. These health behaviors must be considered within the sociopolitical context of Aboriginal people's lives, lest an individualistic perspective predominate the analysis. Aboriginal adults are more than twice as likely to smoke cigarettes as other adults in Canada. We know from other data as well that the rate of smoking has declined substantially in the non-Aboriginal population, but has remained relatively stable among Aboriginal adults. The implications of such high levels of smoking for lung and other kinds of cancer and for breathing problems are serious. First Nations mothers living on reserve are almost twice as likely to smoke during pregnancy compared to Canadian mothers in general, and this pattern continues for smoking more than 10 cigarettes per day and smoking in the third trimester of pregnancy, represented in Table 3, which is on the prior page. More than half of First Nations adults living on reserve are subjected to tobacco smoke in their home from one or more smokers. That's represented in Table 4 on this page. Section 3.2, Physical Environments. Remember, we're going through proximal determinants. So 3.1 was health behaviors. Now we're on to the next proximal determinant, which is physical environments. Okay. Physical environments play a primary role in determining the health of populations. Among Aboriginal peoples, physical environments that are largely detrimental to health have been imposed through historic dispossession of traditional territories as well as current reserve or settlement structures. The most pervasive outcomes of these structures include substantial housing shortages and poor quality of existing homes. Lack of affordable housing has created situations of overcrowding in First Nations and Inuit communities, as well as homelessness for Aboriginal people living in urban areas. Many on-reserve homes are overcrowded and lack of appropriate ventilation, resulting in excessive mold, which has been implicated in several health problems, including severe asthma and allergies among Aboriginal children. Aboriginal peoples living in remote and rural communities and reserve communities face considerable food insecurity related to challenges acquiring both market and traditional foods. The cost of transporting market foods to remote communities means that healthy, nutritious food is not affordable to most families. Poverty not only limits the extent to which individuals and families can access market foods, but also makes the costs associated with contemporary hunting out of reach for many. Finally, poor sanitation and waste management, unsafe water supplies, and lack of community resources represent physical conditions that jeopardize the health of Aboriginal peoples. The quality of the housing stock in a community has been shown to be an important determinant of health. The poor condition of dwellings located on reserve is demonstrated in Table 5, which is on this page, which shows that a third of the housing stock is in need of major repairs compared to only 8% of Canadian dwellings. Other data from the First Nations Regional Longitudinal Health Survey reveals that almost half of the respondents indicate that there was mold or mildew in the home in the 12 months preceding the survey. With the exception of the Métis, Aboriginal people in Canada are much more likely to live in crowded housing conditions than are non-Aboriginal Canadians, and you can see this on Table 6. This is especially the case for the Inuit, who are 10 times more likely to live in crowded conditions. However, there has been some improvement over the 1996 to 2006 decade. In 1996, 36% of Inuit and 7% of Métis and 20% of First Nations lived in crowded housing conditions. Crowding has been linked to a number of poor health outcomes, including increased risk of transmitting infectious diseases, severe lower respiratory tract infections, and higher rates of injuries, mental health problems, and family tension. The quality of housing is also a matter of concern, and the situation is deteriorating over time for the Inuit and First Nations. In 1996, the percentage of Inuit living in housing in need of major repairs stood at 19% and First Nations at 26%. For the Métis, there was a significant improvement over this decade. Section 3.3, we're looking at the next proximal determinant of health, which is employment and income. The literature is clear and convincing about the role of various dimensions of socioeconomic status, or SES, in determining health. Through colonization, colonialism, systemic racism, and discrimination, Aboriginal peoples have been denied access to the resources and conditions necessary to maximize SES. This disadvantage is currently manifested in high rates of unemployment, scarce economic opportunities, poor housing, low literacy and educational attainment, as well as meager community resources. With respect to poverty specifically, the most widely discussed impact of poverty is a lack of access to material resources, such as nutrient-dense food, which leads to high rates of obesity and diabetes, and consequentially poor cardiovascular and renal health. Poverty is also linked to social exclusion, low social cohesion, and increased crime. In the case of Aboriginal peoples, social exclusion in turn prevents individuals from pursuing education and training. More profound, perhaps, is the lack of control poverty creates, with resulting anxiety, insecurity, low self-esteem, and feelings of hopelessness. This and other forms of psychosocial stress have been linked to violence, addictions, poor parenting, and lack of social support. The accumulation of these psychosocial stressors often leads to poor mental health and increased vulnerability to infection, as well as diabetes, high blood pressure, and depression. In addition, suicide has been linked to poor mental health and substance use, which are in turn linked to the social exclusion and poverty. Table 7, which is on this page, shows significant inequalities in the participation of Aboriginal people in the economy. Aboriginal people are less likely than older Canadians to participate in the labor force and participation rate, and are even less likely to be employed, which is employment rate. If they are in the labor force, their level of unemployment, which is called their unemployment rate, is between 2 and 3 times higher than it is for other Canadians. Among Aboriginal people, North American Indians are the most disadvantaged. We have established that Aboriginal people in Canada are less likely to be working. When they do find jobs, their annual earnings for employment are considerably lower than that for other Canadians. This applies when they work full-time, full year, and also when they work part-time or for part of the year. Even sharper inequalities are evident when we look at the total income received in the year. Among North American Indians, for example, the median total income was $12,263 in the year 2000, compared to almost twice that, which was $22,431 for other Canadians. That's represented in Table 8 on this page. Because of the high unemployment and low earnings, it's not surprising to see that income from government transfers, such as social assistance, is a much larger component of total income for Aboriginal persons than it is for other Canadians. We have already suggested that income level has a bearing on health outcomes, and Table 9, which is also on this page, confirms that the percentage of adults, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, reporting that their health is only fair or poor declines substantially as one moves from lower to higher income levels. What the table also shows is that the gap in self-reported health between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people is maintained at a statistically significant level, i.e. a p-value of equal to 0.05, even when comparing individuals with the same similar household incomes. Of course, there are many determinants of health, such as education level, geographic location, employment status, and so forth. Can the gap in health outcome be explained if a large number of known determinants were included in a multivariate analysis? The article from which the above table is drawn undertakes this kind of analysis and concludes that, depending on the health outcome introduced as the dependent variable, the gap is reduced, but it does not go away. This unexplained residual, meaning why it doesn't go away, as it is called, suggests that there must be, quote, something else, end quote, out there that contributes to unequal health outcomes for Aboriginal people, something that has not yet been identified or satisfactorily measured. This lends some indirect support for the notion that the effects of historical trauma, for example, lack of self-determination, may indeed be a determinant of health for Aboriginal populations. Often, differences in health status observed between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal populations can be explained by the fact that the two populations differ in other health-determining respects, such as income and education. However, Table 10, which is on the next page, while it only controls for one variable, suggests that there's more going on. When Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal adults are compared at the same level of income, differences in the likelihood of experiencing a major depressive episode continue to be observed. It is only in the high income category that the difference is reduced to statistically insignificant, which is, again, they state a p-value. Next section, 3.4, education. Education, which is a component of socioeconomic status, determines health through a number of avenues. By way of example, inadequate education often includes poor literacy, which affects one's ability to acquire information about proper nutrition or healthy food preparation. Insufficient education also diminishes the skills one might have to offer the labor market, often resulting in low-paying jobs. The ensuing poverty and social exclusion, both disproportionately experienced by Aboriginal peoples, increases the risk of family instability, which often manifests in divorce and single parenthood. There is clear evidence of inequities in the distribution of resources and opportunities to Aboriginal peoples in Canada. An example can be found in the area of education. Despite the growing number of Aboriginal peoples, particularly women, who are attaining post-secondary degrees, inadequate educational opportunities for most adults manifest as a lack of capacity to promote education among their children. Approximately 22% of Aboriginal youth drop out or are, quote, pushed out, end of quote, of high schools, resulting in diminished literacy and employment, as well as increased poverty in future generations. Table 11, which is at the top of this page, clearly shows how Aboriginal people are disadvantaged when it comes to the level of education attained. The percentage of Aboriginal persons 15 years of age and over who have completed less than a high school education is in the order of 50%, compared to 30% for other Canadians. Leaving school with less than a high school education has been shown to significantly reduce the prospects of employment, income, and other incomes later in life, including health outcomes. The other side of the coin is the very limited representation of Aboriginal people at the higher end of the educational continuum, especially with respect to post-secondary certificates, diplomas, and degrees. Within the Aboriginal population, the Inuit are the most disadvantaged in terms of educational achievement. 3.5, food insecurity. Poverty has clear outcomes on health because, in part, it determines what kinds of foods people have available to them and what they can afford to purchase. Thus, persons at lower incomes are subject to the stress of food insecurity from a compromised diet that results when food is no longer available. In 1998 to 1999, Aboriginal people off reserve were almost 3 times more likely to be living in households experiencing food insecurity than was the case for all Canadians. So 27% compared to 10% for all Canadians. Table 12, which is on this page, shows that this condition is strongly related to low income as well as single parent status, both of which we know from other data are more likely to occur in Aboriginal households. Thus, the high prevalence of food insecurity for Aboriginal people is not surprising. In the literature, food insecurity is related to health outcomes that include multiple chronic conditions, obesity, distress, and depression. So far, we have discussed proximal determinants of health as individual level determinants. That is, particular characteristics of individuals, such as poverty, leading to particular individual level health outcomes, such as stress or obesity. Some work has been done, however, to aggregate individual level characteristics into community averages and to construct community level well-being scores. Chapter 4, Intermediate Determinants of Health. While proximal determinants represent the root of much ill health among Aboriginal peoples, intermediate determinants can be thought of as the origin of these proximal determinants. For instance, poverty and deleterious physical environments are rooted in a lack of community infrastructure, resources, and capacities, as well as restricted environmental stewardship. Likewise, inequitable healthcare and educational systems often act as barriers to accessing or developing health-promoting behaviors, resources, and opportunities. The interaction of intermediate determinants is especially evident in the connection between cultural continuity and other intermediate determinants, all of which have a direct influence on proximal determinants. So in this chapter, we're going through intermediate. Our first one is section 4.1, the intermediate determinant of healthcare systems. In order to realize the benefit of an advanced healthcare system, Canadian individuals must have physical, political, and social access to those services. This is often not the case for Aboriginal peoples. The federal system of healthcare delivery for Status First Nations people resembles a collage of public health programs with limited accountability, fragmented delivery, and jurisdictional ambiguity. Moreover, current healthcare services remain focused on communicable diseases, while mortality and morbidity among Aboriginal peoples are increasingly resulting from chronic illness. Social access to healthcare is similarly limited or denied to Aboriginal peoples through health systems that account for neither culture nor language or the social and economic determinants of Aboriginal people's health. Another determinant of positive health outcomes is having access to the required services on a timely basis. Table 13, which is on this page, shows different patterns of utilization of healthcare professionals and suggests more limited access to doctors and dentists. This is most notable in the North, where nurses play a stronger role. Also, a higher percentage of Aboriginal people indicate that they have unmet healthcare needs. As with other Canadians, First Nations adults living on reserve have difficulty accessing healthcare services because of long wait lists. And they say, look at Table 4. Table 4 is also, or 14, it's on the right side of this page. In addition, however, they are limited by needed services not being covered or approved by the federal non-insured health benefit plan and by doctors or nurses not being available in their area. Reports that the healthcare provided was inadequate or not culturally appropriate were also frequently mentioned barriers. The fact that many First Nations adults live in rural and more isolated communities and at very low levels of income led to a number of economic barriers to accessing healthcare. Okay, we're going on through intermediate determinants of health. We're now on the second one. So section 4.2 is on educational systems. Adequate education, which in many ways continues to be denied to Aboriginal peoples, has a profound impact on income, employment, and living conditions. Well-educated parents not only earn higher incomes, thereby improving proximal determinants of health, but they also pass the value of education and lifelong learning on to the next generation. Preschool programs have demonstrated the most favorable, quote, return on investment, end quote, among Aboriginal children. In fact, Not only has education been correlated with optimal child development, but it also has been shown to mitigate some of the effects of poor child development on adult health. Yet programs such as Aboriginal Head Start continue to be underfunded. Similarly, although the benefits of, quote, culturally competent, end quote, curricula have been demonstrated to retain Aboriginal high school students, most curricula continue to lack any focus on Indigenous content or learning styles. Finally, mainstream education systems pay little attention to social determinants that might act as obstacles for Aboriginal children and youth realizing the most from their education. Section 4.3, the third intermediate determinant of health, is community infrastructure, resources, and capacities. The health of an individual and their family is substantially influenced by the community in which they live. In the case of Aboriginal peoples, the Assembly of First Nations and others contend that economic development is a key determinant of health. Limited infrastructure and resource development opportunities have been important contributors to economic insecurity and marginalization, with subsequent deprivation among community members. In addition, inadequate social resources in the form of qualified individuals who can develop and/or implement programs restrict Aboriginal communities' access to funding. When communities experience fragmented, underfunded programs in which the bureaucracy increases community responsibility without a concomitant increase in power, community-level stress and paralysis can result. Section 4.4, Environmental Stewardship. Another key intermediate determinant of health has been widely recognized is environmental stewardship. In fact, traditional ties to the natural environment are generally acknowledged as a major resource for the superior health enjoyed by Indigenous peoples prior to European colonization of the Americas. Unfortunately, the past 500 years have witnessed a rapid transition from a healthy relationship with the natural world to one of dispossession and disempowerment. Aboriginal peoples are no longer stewards of their traditional territories, nor are they permitted to share in the profits from extraction and manipulation of the resources. Finally, contamination of wildlife, fish, vegetation, and water has forced Aboriginal people further from the natural environment that once sustained community health. The Regional Health Survey reveals that a high proportion of First Nations adults are still tied to the land when it comes to food sources, but very few believe that there has been much progress made in the community in renewing their relationship to the land, and that's symbolized in Table 15, which is on the prior page. Section 4.5, Cultural Continuity. A landmark study conducted by Chandler and Lalonde in 1998 revealed that among First Nations people in British Columbia, rate of suicide, which are strongly linked to intermediate determinants, varied dramatically and were associated with a constellation of characteristics referred to as, quote, cultural continuity, end quote. Cultural continuity might be best described as the degree of social or cultural cohesion within a community. According to Chandler and Lalonde, low rates or an absence of suicide in a community appear to be related to land title, self-government, particularly with the involvement of women, control of education, security and cultural facilities, as well as control of the policies and practice of health and social programs. Cultural continuity also involves traditional intergenerational connectedness, which is maintained through intact families and the engagement of elders who pass traditions to subsequent generations. Overall, it appears that the percentage of First Nations persons claiming knowledge of an Aboriginal language is holding steady at about 30%, and this is represented in Table 16 from the preceding page. But this masks some slight gains for the on-reserve population and some losses on the part of those living off-reserve. There's cause for concern both because of the off-reserve percentages being so low and because the younger age groups are much more less likely to report knowing an Aboriginal language compared to those in the older age groups. Use of the Inuktitut language by Inuit is quite high, especially in Inuit Nunat, or homeland territories such as Nunavik and Nunavut, where it approaches 100%, and that's represented in Table 17, which is on the top of this page. However, comparisons between 1996 and a decade later suggest that the use of the language is declining. In contrast to Inuit and First Nations populations, the percentage of Métis with knowledge of an Aboriginal language is quite low, and this is especially the case for those in the younger groups, and you can see this represented at Table 18 on this page. We know from other results that Cree is the most common language of the Métis, followed by Dene and Ojibwe. Very few speak Michif, the traditional language of the Métis, which involves a mixture of Cree and French languages. According to the Regional Health Survey, close to 3/4 of First Nations adults living on reserve consider traditional spirituality and religion to be very or somewhat important in their lives. Chapter 5, Distal Determinants of Health. Distal determinants have the most profound influence on the health of populations because they represent political, economic, and social contexts that construct both intermediate and proximal determinants. In the case of Aboriginal peoples, although intra- and intergroup differences exist, to a large extent, colonialism, racism, and social exclusion, as well as repression of self-determination, act as the distal determinants within which all other determinants are constructed. Historical research clearly indicates a link between the social inequalities created by colonialism and the disease, disability, violence, and early death experienced by Aboriginal peoples in Canada. According to Kelm, quote, colonization is a process that includes geographic incursion, sociocultural dislocation, the establishment of external political control and economic dispossession, the provision of low-level social services, and ultimately, the creation of ideological formulations around race and skin color that position the colonizer at a higher evolution level than the colonized, end quote. While neocolonialism detrimentally influences the health of contemporary Aboriginal peoples, historic successive traumatic events continue to affect generations through which has been referred to as, quote, historical or cultural trauma, end quote. In essence, the collective burden of a repressive colonial system has created conditions of physical, psychological, economic, and political disadvantage for Aboriginal peoples. So, we're looking at the first distal determinant of health, 5.1, is colonialism. Colonialism impacts the health of Aboriginal peoples by producing social, political, and economic inequalities that, quote, trickle down, end quote, through the construction of unfavorable intermediate and proximal determinants. The specific mechanisms of colonialism occur in diverse domains, such as environmental relationships, social policies, and political power. The impact of colonialism on Aboriginal people's relationship with the environment began with their disposition and displacement from traditional lands in the 20th century. Essentially, people were restricted from or forbidden to hunt, trap, or fish for the purpose of subsistence. Several Indigenous authors contend that the historic trauma experienced by many Aboriginal peoples is rooted in this dislocation from the land. In support of this, researchers have discovered that traditional harvesting is linked to a greater rapport with the land, an increased sense of self-reliance, and enhanced overall health. The political agenda of the 20th century colonial system was to assimilate and acculturate Indigenous peoples into the dominant culture. This agenda is evident in legislation and social policies that reward assimilation through resources and opportunities, while punishing cultural retention through the creation of inequities. Perhaps the most powerful mechanism of assimilation was the residential schools, which were often considered the vanguard of genocide and resocialization of Aboriginal peoples. Through these schools, culture, language, family ties, and community networks were destroyed for generations of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children. The result has been dramatic and devastating sociocultural change among all Aboriginal peoples, including disengagement by many from their ancestry and culture. One of the major dimensions of historical trauma is the experience that Aboriginal students went through in attending residential schools, an experience that still has ramifications today for the health and well-being not only of the survivors, but also their children and grandchildren. Of the adults interviewed by the First Nations Regional Longitudinal Health Survey, 20% are survivors of residential schools, a figure that jumps to almost 50% for those who are in the, quote, above 50, end quote, age bracket. Almost half of the survivors report that the experience negatively affected their health and well-being. Table 20 on this page also reveals that 43% of their children believe the residential school experience of their parents had a negative effect on the parenting skills of their parents. Specific aspects of the residential school experience are identified as contributing to the negative impact on health and well-being of the survivors. You can look at the appendices, tables 31 and 32 if you like. Okay, the next distal determinant in section 5.2 is racism and social exclusion. Racism and social exclusion have been a reality for Aboriginal peoples since first contact with British colonizers. The colonial system created social stratification among racial lines, with a consequent hierarchical distribution of resources, power, freedom, and control, all of which detrimentally affected Aboriginal health. Education, income, and economy are driven by social policies, making the inequitable distribution of these determinants a social justice issue for Aboriginal peoples. Racism and its subsequent social exclusion continue to create barriers to Aboriginal participation and productivity in the national economy. Without equitable distribution of the determinants of health, Aboriginal peoples cannot realize the same possibilities for health. Relegated to the bottom of the social hierarchy, Aboriginal peoples continue to be exposed to health damaging intermediate and proximal determinants, which increase their vulnerability to illness and reduce the capacity to address ill health. Research is now establishing that groups subjected to racial and other forms of discrimination may well have more negative health outcomes because of the stress of living in a racially charged environment. While the level of racism affecting particular groups is difficult to measure, one approach is to ask respondents if they have experienced racism within a given time period. In response to such a question, almost 40% of First Nations adults living on reserve say they've experienced racism in the 12 months prior to the survey, and that's listed in Table 21, which is on the right of this page. When Aboriginal youth experience social exclusion, research indicates that alcohol and drug use increases. Furthermore, 27% of those who experience racism say that it had some or a strong effect on their level of self-esteem. Section 5.3, the next distal determinant is self-determination. Self-determination has been cited as the most important determinant of health among Aboriginal peoples. Self-determination influences all other determinants, including education, housing, safety, and health opportunities. Recently, Chandler and Lalonde provided evidence of this link through an inverse relation between self-determination and suicide among First Nations in British Columbia. In order to ensure the most favorable intermediate determinant of health, Aboriginal peoples must participate equally in political decision-making, as well as possess control over their lands, economies, education systems, and social and health services. Unfortunately, this is not the case. Rather, the colonial agenda has enforced unequal access to and control over property, economic assets, and health services. In many ways, this restrictive structure has actually encouraged Aboriginal social, political, and economic development that is not self-determined. Equity requires authority and freedom, and with authority involving material, psychosocial, and political domains. Unfortunately, colonial governments and institutions do not act upon evidence, resulting in unequal participation of Aboriginal people in political institutions that govern their fate. Some research has traced a link between self-determination at the community level and health outcomes. It appears that there's also a connection at the individual level between the degree to which persons believe that they're in control of their lives on the one hand and feelings of depression on the other, and you can see this illustrated on this page in Table 22. Chapter 6, Conclusion. Data presented in this paper clearly demonstrate the burdensome health disparities facing all Aboriginal peoples. Yet these disparities are not homogeneous and must be understood within the diverse and sometimes disparate context with which First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people live. Beyond health behaviors, the evidence is clear that social determinants at proximal, intermediate, and distal levels influence health in complex and dynamic ways. The individual and cumulative effects of inequitable social determinants of health are evident in the diminished physical, mental, and emotional health experienced by many Aboriginal peoples. Unfavorable distal, intermediate, and proximal determinants of health are associated with increased stress through lack of control, diminished immunity, and resiliency to disease and social problems, as well as decreased capacity to address ill health. The complex interactions between various determinants appears to create a trajectory of health for individuals that must be addressed through a social determinants approach. It is clear that the origin of good health arises long before conception, with the historical, political, economic, and social context into which we are born. After birth, distal, intermediate, and proximal determinants continue to influence health over the lifespan. Beginning in early childhood, social determinants establish a potential trajectory that is only moderately mutable in the current social and economic context within which many Aboriginal children live. Access to resources for health during this critical developmental stage has implications over the entire life course, particularly for adult health. In fact, Marmot suggests that, quote, the seeds of adult health and health inequity are sown early in childhood. And this is Michael Marmot, who is the head of the United Nations Commission on Social Determinants of Health. For example, children require a healthy environment in order to maximize brain development and ability to learn and experience themselves in the world. Less than optimal development has consequences not just for adult health, but also for the health of subsequent generations through the perpetuation of unhealthy environments created by inequitable determinants. Aboriginal peoples are the fastest growing demographic group in Canada, with almost 60% of the Aboriginal population under the age of 25. The health consequences of unhealthy developmental environments for this fast-growing population of children and youth are obvious, considerable, compounding, and potentially devastating. Section 6.1, Putting it together, the Integrated Life Course and Social Determinants Model of Aboriginal Health. The complex, intersecting, and interrelated determinants and context of Aboriginal health requires a model that permits researchers to explore the pathways that influence health and points at which interventions will be most effective. The Integrated Life Course and Social Determinants Model of Aboriginal Health depicts life stages, sociopolitical contexts, and social determinants as nested spheres of origin, influence, and impact, each affecting the other in temporally and contextually dynamic and integrated ways. The model incorporates 4 dimensions of health across the life course, including physical, spiritual, emotional, and mental. This multidimensional construct reflects Aboriginal contexts and social determinants that not only have a direct impact on health, but also interact with one another to create vulnerabilities and capacities for health. The Integrated Life Course and Social Determinants Model of Aboriginal Health permits not only the examination of the distal, intermediate, and proximal determinants of health, but also accounts for the unique sociopolitical contexts, life stages, and dimensions of health that act as pathways through which determinants express influence. The model encourages examination of the ways in which sociopolitical contexts and life stages are shaped by and in turn shape social determinants of all domains of health. The model also permits an analysis of how the differential health impacts of social determinants on children, youth, and adults is filtered through diverse Aboriginal sociopolitical contexts within and across Inuit, Métis, and First Nations communities, including urban, rural, and settlements and reserves. Sociopolitical context not only represents filters through which social determinants influence health, but they also represent barriers and opportunities for addressing children, youth, and adult health. The Integrated Life Course and Social Determinants Model of Aboriginal Health conceptualizes the origin and influence of social determinants with distal, intermediate, and proximal domains. This classification is based on Marmot's 2005 reference to the, quote, causes of the causes, end quote, of health. Proximal, intermediate, and distal social determinants are filtered through sociopolitical contexts, life stages, and health dimensions, so physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual, to shape overall well-being. The sphere reflects not only the multidimensionality of each domain of health and its social determinants, but also the interrelatedness of these domains. Although the model adds additional layers of abstraction to current Aboriginal health models, it also reflects in the reality of what is now clearly understood as a complex and dynamic interplay of social, political, historical, cultural, environmental, economic, and other forces that directly and indirectly shape Aboriginal health. A particular advantage of this model is that it permits an exploration of potential trajectories of life influence across the life course, of health influence across the life course. The notion of health trajectories not only corresponds with many Indigenous ideologies which employ temporal concepts to understanding health, but might also facilitate prediction of the ways socially determined health vulnerabilities among children and youth are predictive of health problems during adulthood. Ultimately, assessment of social determinants could lead to individual, family, and/or community interventions that improve health outcomes. The end. The rest of it is appendices.